much for having me here as part of this exciting intellectual project in this beautiful city, Buenos Aires. And I look forward to a very rich discussion that my presentation will hopefully bring. Sometimes I would muse on the idea that I have had the best training to do research on sex work. I attended 15 years of Catholic school. I went to Catholic church with my grandmother. Then I started going to evangelical churches with my mother for 10 years and taught Sunday school for the last 5 of those years. It goes without saying that this background gave me a solid foundation on ideas about sex work or prostitution, that it was about dehumanization, humiliation, and stigmatization. And most importantly, prostitution was the antithesis of love. With so much religious and moral baggage, my anthropological research on military prostitution in South Korea was essentially a series of epistemic shocks, pushing me to reflect on my own personal conceptual limitations and boundaries at every turn of the way. In 1998, I started doing research on what is called R&R, rest and recreation facilities for US servicemen in Korea. The Korean Peninsula was a Japanese colony in 1910 until the end of World War II in 1945, and then it became divided, with the North being supported by Soviet Russia and China, and the South by the US. Though the Korean War ended in 1953, North and South Koreas are still technically at war. US military thus saw the need to station troops on the peninsula as part of the efforts to contain communism. When I was doing research in South Korea in 1998 to 2000, there were 37,000 US military personnel in Korea. And since it was a one-year hardship tour in a war zone, most of them were in Korea alone without their families, and many of them were young men who had never left their home before. Obviously, there were clubs catering to the needs of these servicemen. I was drawn to the experiences of Korean women working in these military camp towns because they were stigmatized as Western whores and Western princesses for their sexual liaisons with American soldiers. But when I arrived in 1998, I found that Filipino and ex-Soviet states women were replacing Korean women in the clubs. Foreign laborers have been brought into South Korea since the late 1980s as part of the state-initiated globalization project, usually for jobs in small factories, and they started working in the clubs in mid-1990s. This is just to show you some of the US military camp towns. This has a sign, America Town, in a war village. This is some of the wall painting in America Town. And these are the clubs. These are rather different from the clubs that you may be going to. They are very small, sometimes as small as a 3-by-3 meter room. And these are some of the women that I did my research on and with. And in this picture, we were in a sticker photo shop, and we were putting on different wigs to take photographs. I show this picture for obvious reasons because they are laughing here rather happily, even though they have been labeled as trafficked women. Third world women who migrate to engage in military prostitution for US soldiers became a potentially explosive topic. It was the late 1990s when concerns about human trafficking were drumming out a protocol at the United Nations. To the outsiders and the many feminist scholars and activists who have spoken on the subject before me, I was naturally researching on the violence that militarism, patriarchy, capitalism, and globalization has wrought on the women. But in my fieldwork, not a day went by without me talking with the Filipinos and the GIs, as well as Korean club owners about girlfriends, boyfriends, fights, jealousy, suspicion, and love. Juggling between an exploding discourse of human trafficking that the state, global and national NGOs were using to describe the women, like these Filipinos, and my everyday interactions with them was making me a little schizophrenic. Yes, they did have to deal with difficult labor conditions and the stigma of being fallen and foreign, yet most of the women have found trafficking. The employers withheld their passports, withheld salaries, and arbitrarily imposed penalties. If we use the framework of trafficking to understand their lives and presence in the camp towns, presuming their sexual victimhood, and work towards rescuing them and sending them home, and then locking away their customer boyfriends, we may not only be working against their wishes, we will also never understand why these women want to stay on in the clubs, why they want to meet GIs rather than run away from them, and why they may have sex, sometimes for free, sometimes for money, and why they even talk about love in such a setting. So I'm happy to report that from almost 2 decades of researching and reflecting on issues of sex work, migration, and human trafficking, one of the most important lessons I learned was about love. Love is not necessarily transcendental, spontaneous, irrational, and calculating, ideas that I grew up with. Love can grow out of gratitude. Love could be learned rather than fallen into. Love could be about how much money is given or given up for another person. Love does not have to be only about one's own feelings, but also the well-being and satisfaction of one's family. These were ideas remote from my notion of love, but why do I get to have a monopoly about what love means? It is certainly not my claim that love is the great equalizer that could erase the power differentials between Filipino entertainers and their GI boyfriends and customers. Rather, my research argues that love can be an integral part of the ongoing negotiations in their structurally asymmetrical relationships, and interpersonal dynamics could be configured differently. In short, seeing the lives of these women from their own perspective, rather than any ideological position, may be a good starting point. This could be one way to answer the question of this year's IASSCS conference. What's love got to do with it? But I would like to push us further the question, who is asking this question? And for what purposes? From what perspective is love presumed to be irrelevant to the marketplace? And why is this irrelevance particularly disturbing when it comes to sex? These questions come from a history of failure. My own failure to communicate with anti-prostitution activists who categorically see all women in prostitution as victims of sex trafficking. Today, I would like to share with you my attempt to understand this seeming deadlock by trying to understand the subjectivity of the advocate. And as my research on sex workers has taught me, we may benefit from understanding the effective investment of these activities in their work. Let me start with an incident in the summer of 2005, just shortly after the new anti-prostitution or anti-trafficking laws in South Korea were introduced, leading to heavy crackdowns and numerous arrests of sex workers, clients, and brothel owners. The laws were held by women NGOs, Korean state, and the US State Department as a best practice in combating trafficking, and women advocates have been at the forefront of promoting this view. I met one of these advocates, Ms. Jo, in her office. She was director of the biggest anti-prostitution NGO in South Korea's capital, Seoul. Her organization began using the term prostituted women to emphasize the passivity of the women rather than the word prostitutes. A week before my meeting with Ms. Jo, there was the launch of the first sex workers organization. While Ms. Jo supported the laws on prostitution, the sex workers were demanding a suspension of the laws, recognition of sex as work, and protection of sex workers' rights. Ms. Jo became quite emotional as she talked about the suffering of prostituted women, the challenges of her work, including threats from brothel owners and pimps. Her eyes teared up when I asked why it was so important to eliminate prostitution. Ms. Jo responded that it was the only way to achieve women's rights. It was a historical responsibility. She said, if we don't fight for the criminalization of prostitution, then more young women would enter prostitution. I then asked what she thought about the women who continued to work and identify as sex workers. To my surprise, Ms. Jo leaned forward, slapped her hand on the coffee table, raised her voice for the first time and said, "Then it's their own fault." I was taken aback by the intensity of her response, but it was also most illuminating. Women who refused to leave prostitution were willful deviants who'd endanger other women. So it mattered little whether the women found prostitution victimizing. They should not be demanding to stay in prostitution, not to mention be recognized as sex workers. First, I was perplexed in the last decade by activists' refrain of victims of sex trafficking as the penultimate victim of violence on one hand, and their ready condemnation of those women who identify as sex workers. How come these activists, who work so tirelessly to help women in prostitution, see those who speak up as sex workers as the enemy and unworthy of dialogue? While I witnessed this mostly in South Korea, it was by no means a Korean monopoly, but rather commonplace in a range of international activist forums. What has made the sexually violated woman such a popular refrain at this historical juncture in activist discourses, government policies, the media, and the global arena? What could the revival of the sexually violated woman as a symbol of multiple anxieties tell us about gender and justice in neoliberal times? Second, I have finally come to see the inadequacy of rationalist critiques in grasping the vehemence of the determination of activists like Ms. Zhou to study affect amongst anti-trafficking activists like Ms. Zhou may help us gain a deeper understanding of their subjectivity, how they echo with each other, as well as how they configure their relationship to this world, and how they shape the direction in which the movement is going. I have no doubt that Ms. Zhou and other activists are sincere about promoting what they understand as women's rights. As Joan Scott recently argues with fantasy, people aren't mobilized according to purely objective interests, but rather according to interests created for them by collective fantasies. If there is a collective fantasy underlying the campaigns against prostitution, what could it be? What is the effective logic in their passionate proclamations? In this fantasy, what and who are being excluded and silenced? The rise of anti-trafficking discourses took place globally and nationally in South Korea since 2000 and led to the formulation of the new anti-prostitution laws in 2004. Incited by the deaths of women in a series of brothel fires, prostitution became the main cause of the South Korean women's movement, ushering South Korea into the global wave of anti-trafficking initiatives. The term prostituted woman, emphasizing women's victimhood, replaced the derogatory terms of fallen women in Korean. The figure of the prostituted woman echoes with the violated national body under foreign aggression in nationalist historiography. I look at how the victimhood of the prostituted woman actually resonates with the victimhood of women activists and that of the nation. This examination of activists' effective investment may generate insight into the dynamics of collective action and throws light on the cultural and effective logic of victimhood, questioning whether making the prostituted woman responsible for a nation's future may promote a heteronormative gender and sexual order, while silencing the pursuits of broader critique of inequalities and rights, in effect buttressing the neoliberal order. So there are some things you need to know about how I did the research and what this paper draws on. It draws on my observation and engagement with the anti-prostitution movement in South Korea since 1998 till now. Before 2000, prostitution was only the concerns of a few local service providers. No national organization was involved in this cause. But after 2000, anti-prostitution, using the language of trafficking, became the major movement in South Korea. It was therefore a dramatic change to see the sudden rise of the anti-prostitution movement. And activists were successful in lobbying for the new laws. While the laws provided living allowance, vocational training, medical service, and shelter to those who wished to leave prostitution, they also continued to criminalize those who could not prove that they are victims. When the laws were launched in September 2004, thousands of women in prostitution rallied and marched in front of local government as well as the national assemblies, demanding the suspension of the law and the crackdown on their means of livelihood. 15 women went on a hunger strike in front of the National Assembly in Seoul to demand a meeting with women activists, officials, and the suspension of the laws in 2004. As I watched the hunger strike of sex workers against the laws from overseas in the US, I was getting updates from friends who were visiting the strikers and the condition of women sex workers that I was familiar with. I then mobilized efforts for a petition signed by 25 international women activists and academics in late 2004. The petition made a simple request: respond to their request for a meeting. This petition was sent to all women organizations in South Korea. While it was not a hostile accusation, but rather a plea, the petition was taken in general as an attempt by foreigners to meddle in domestic affairs. I was identified as the main culprit, and this therefore set the stage of my interactions with these activists in subsequent years. While some refused to engage with me, some were generous with their time and ideas. So despite the currency that sexual victimhood may have in making claims, particularly for women, scholars have been critical of its transformative potential for social justice. Wendy Brown exposed the fetishization of the wound in subaltern politics, turning all political claims into claims of injury, and thereby depoliticizing the histories and reproducing the structures that have produced the wound, foreclosing the possibilities of change. Ratna Kapoor has warned against the tragedy of victimization, and how the women's human rights movement has focused on violence against women, reproducing particular gender and cultural essentialisms while reinforcing the woman as a victim subject. Jodi Dean suggests that the criminal is a strange attractor for displaced anxieties around the brutality of the neoliberal economy. Contemporary analysis of the rise of the criminal justice system have pointed out how the crime victim, rather than a rights-bearing citizen, has become the ideal legalized subject, replacing grassroots and social service remedies with penal reforms. Elizabeth Bernstein provided an incisive analysis of the carceral politics in US-based feminism in neoliberalism. The trafficking victim has been coupled with calls for an aggressive pursuit of the male criminal in order to police male sexuality, reinforcing the middle-class family value of amateur sexual ethics in heterosexual marriage that is now key to the maintenance of neoliberal social and economic order. While the anti-trafficking efforts in South Korea share similarities with these analyses, the burden of guilt is not so much on individual evil men than on foreign aggressors. By the same token, the victim subject is not so much individual women, but rather women as oppressed of the oppressed, and the emasculated Korean nation. In other words, the passionate activism of women advocates to combat trafficking ushered the neoliberal victim criminal paradigm seamlessly into Korean nationalist narratives. I'll say a few words about victimhood nationalism and the redemptive power of the figure of the prostitute. In Korean nationalist historiography, violation is written into the fate of the nation and the collective suffering of the Korean people. Ji Hyun-Nim suggested using victimhood nationalism to examine how victimhood becomes an important part of national identity and solidarity. The defiled woman, as a symbol of the nation's victimhood, has had a long history in South Korea, and in particular with US military camptown prostitution, because the prostitute was simultaneously perceived as being both victim of Western imperialism and faithless profiteers of American capitalism. Both pitied and despised, the whore thus became a symbol of the nation's shame, as well as the rallying point for national resistance. A good case in point was, in 1992, a young 26-year-old woman, Yoon Keum-mi, who worked in one of these clubs for US military, was killed by a US soldier. She was found naked, bruised, and with various objects inserted into her body. It triggered a fury across the nation. The protest soon developed into the national campaign for the eradication of US military crimes. Despite her marginalization to the fringes of Korean society when she was alive, the brutal way in which she died transformed her into an allegory of the masculinist nation. One of the female staff of the national campaign pointed out this drastic switch. She said, "The men in the movement call Camptown women Western whores when they are alive, but once they are killed by GIs, they immediately call them the respected elder sisters of the nation." The current generation of women activist leaders in South Korea has been nurtured by the struggle against capitalist exploitation and military authoritarianism in the women's labor movement in the 1970s, and then the democratization movement in the 1980s. They also came to reject the patriarchy and misogyny in the male-dominated democratic movement, which gave rise to people's feminism or Minjung feminism. Minjung feminism understood women as the oppressed of the oppressed, people who suffered most in a subjugated nation, dominated by a national elite that sold out to imperialists and colonizers, and embedded in Confucian patriarchy. For these activists, prostitution grew out of colonialism, militarism, and then sex tourism, promoted by an authoritarian developmental state. Prostitution was also the ultimate degradation that women could be reduced to. Two of the well-known slogans in the women's labor movement in the 1970s were, "Our only wish is to keep our jobs," and "Don't force us into prostitution," referring to the tragic consequence of labor cuts for women. The demand for basic workers' rights for women came with a reassertion of the distinction between factory labor and sexual labor. Competitive victimhood and the search for authenticity came to frame subsequent discussion about prostitution. The reframing of the prostitute as innocent victims of a series of patriarchal and foreign violence allowed the prostitute to emerge as the most oppressed of the oppressed of the oppressed. In the late 1980s, knowledge about the Japanese military's forcible recruitment of women for sexual servitude between the late 1930s and 1945, also known as the comfort women, became widely publicized. Korean women activists successfully rallied around the cause and became part of an important transnational movement by the late 1990s. The fallen woman can now be considered victims, although largely as a symbol of the nation's victimhood. But as passivity and innocence became the defining axis of victimhood, a hierarchy of victims emerges. Those who came forth increasingly distinguished between voluntary prostitution and virgins who were forced into prostitution. Leaders and survivors of the comfort women movement emphasized how they were sex slaves, kidnapped, while women in US military camp towns were willing whores, since there was no comparable system of enslavement. This propensity for women as the victim subject is magnified in the anti-prostitution movement in the new millennium, as local mobilization is vitalized by the global campaign to combat the traffic in women. The prostitute became the symbol of all that is wrong with Korean society historically and contemporarily, while making South Korea a global partner in the combat against trafficking. The only solution is by restoring a Korean past without prostitution. Let me give you another story. In 2005, I went to Seoul for the World Congress of Women that was held at Ewha Women's University. But for those in the women's movement who were in the know about the laws and their implementation, I was not an academic presenting an argument, but the foreigner who dared to challenge their success. And one of those in the audience members was Ms. Cho, who was the director of the Korea Women's Association United. Ms. Cho would be the director of the state-financed Center for Women's Human Rights to coordinate and train all service providers under the auspices of the new laws 5 months later. At the panel, Ms. Cho raised her hand and criticized some of my efforts, but also said with much gravitas, "When I received the petition from you, I was very shocked, because it was the first time in my life of working in the women's movement for 25 years to have received a petition from others. All my life I've been petitioning other people, but I have never received one. So I was very shocked to receive the appeal. It was so antagonistic." Most poignant in this lament was how the petition violated her identity as the oppressed of the oppressed. she had always and only been a part of the powerless petitioning to the powerful. Masculinist institutions, including employers, labor unions, and the state. The fact that she could be at the receiving end of a petition was incompatible with her ideal of being a member of the oppressed. Taking her emotions expressed as genuine, Ms. Cho's affective bond with prostituted women, generated not so much from her interaction and shared rituals with them, and through her passionate advocacy, has allowed her to erase hierarchy and difference between herself and women in prostitution. 4 months before this encounter, sex workers did send a petition to Ms. Cho. To mention that at the panel, however, would attribute too much agency, collective identity, and visibility to the sex workers. In fact, when Ms. Cho was asked to comment on the Sex Workers Festival, first time ever in South Korea, this is what she said. I could not even begin to understand the concept that prostitutes autonomously organize an open gathering. The women have only been mobilized by employers, the pimps, who have been pushed into a predicament by the special laws of prostitution. Here, Cho was highlighting both the lack of agency of prostitutes and the super agency of the pimps. She and other activist leaders had consistently referred to any organized efforts of sex workers, including public protests, sit-ins, and hunger strikes, as coerced by the pimps. To attribute to these pimps the power to mobilize thousands of women to protest, chant slogans, and march in the cities, and more than a dozen of them to go on a hunger strike, is to produce the monstrosity and threat of the criminal, and to justify stronger law enforcement. What do activists like Cho want the laws to achieve? Cho was one of the main proponents of the idea that prostitution is a product of Japanese colonialism and then of US military occupation, and subsequently the globalization of Western sexual mores and capitalism. In other words, prostitution is not indigenous to Korean society and culture and can therefore be purged. With the rise of the anti-trafficking campaign globally, the prostitute as victim of trafficking thus came to the forefront of the women's movement as an emblem of women's subordination in Korea, bearing the symbolic burden of women's oppression in both nationalist history and capitalist patriarchy. Ms. Cho's passionate insistence that prostitution is the worst situation a woman could end up in continues after her tenure as director of the Center for Women's Human Rights. Cho became a board member of CONICET, Coalition Against Trafficking Women, and speaks internationally as an expert on the subject of prostitution and sex trafficking in South Korea. In a 2011 publication for ALITT, an abolitionist organization in India, Cho proclaimed that women try to get married as a job or a job marriage. Women who do not get married can only go into the sex industry. On another occasion, Ms. Cho said, again and again, women die no matter what site the brothel is in. Such is the insidiousness of patriarchy and its tragic consequence for South Korean women. Cho used the prostitute woman to extend her long-standing criticism of patriarchy in South Korea and that women are the oppressed of the oppressed. And logically for Cho, women in prostitution have to be the most oppressed of these oppressed. This logic echoes well with international abolitionist organizations like CONICET that has contained trafficking as an issue that afflicts mainly, if not only, women and girls of the world. Within the competitive victimhood framework of the women's movement in South Korea, the prostituted woman acquired the status of the authentic victim, symbolizing all that is wrong with Korean society, embodying the injustices that the nation has suffered as a whole. This status of authenticity further extends to the activists who labor on their behalf. Such convictions and their associated effect do not only take effect in their home countries, they further circulate in the global arena through such activities as Ms. Cho's, lending credibility and appeal to the abolitionist movement. Ms. Cho Jin-gyeol, the woman who slapped her hand on the coffee table, whom I mentioned earlier, she became the director of the NGO in 2004, responsible for all anti-prostitution work in the capital city of Seoul. For her, combating sex trafficking was a covenant with God, a personal quest and a national duty to rescue the nation from the path to ruins and restore its glory. In an interview, Jo expressed her personal commitment as such. Jo felt that supporting victims of prostitution was like the activists. She felt strongly empowered by the process of taking victims of prostitution away from their contractors. Everything happened because God heard the cries of the victims. Jo has received a myriad of threats, but the big miracle is that she has been witnessing helped her experience greater confidence. Here, Jo made reference to the Exodus in the Christian Bible and indirectly compared herself to Moses, who led God's chosen people out of enslavement into salvation. It is an effective imagery to appeal to a Korean identity that is built on memories of a history marked by hardship and suffering. And to the Christian population in South Korea, it appeals to the idea of the Koreans as God's chosen people, following the Jews. Furthermore, presenting herself as a savior and a possible martyr brought as much attention to herself as a hero and to her faith in God. Representing herself as a woman activist who devoted her life and work to saving women victims in South Korea, Jo embodied the victim and the hero of the nation in one. Prostitution was a symbol of all that is wrong, and eliminating prostitution would therefore be symbolic of all that is right, to set Korea on the right path of peace, democratization, gender equality, and women's rights. As Cho said, to eliminate prostitution is to eliminate the symbol that maintains a masculine and patriarchal society, to create a symbol of gender equality, to support opposition to military culture, civil disobedience, to support and ally with the many women's organizations that seek to empower women and women's presence in society. Eliminating prostitution was therefore the historical and social responsibility for all Koreans, including those who work in prostitution. Jo said, everyone has historical and social responsibilities. The same applies to women in prostitution. Those who proclaim themselves as sex workers have to think, who is this idea benefiting? Who are being helped by their own statements and actions? So what is the goal of Ms. Jo? Through this collective quest, the nation would be put on a path to regional and global leadership, as Ms. Jo said. Let's make history and become the outpost for comprehensively solving the problem of prostitution in the Asian region and the unprecedented leader of women's human rights in the world. Let's try to raise our country's status so that our descendants can live proudly as world citizens in the future. For Jo, the anti-prostitution movement was an opportunity. The women's movement was offering to the nation to right past wrongs and be a respectable nation-state of the world. Obliterating the structure of prostitution would not only be a symbolic success, but also a concrete step towards eliminating the entrenched moral and social flaws of modernization, industrialization, militarism, capitalism, and of course, patriarchy. The sufferings of the nation and the women's movement could be rectified through the catalyst of the prostituted woman. So what are the silences and the footnotes in this passionate proclamation? The fixation on women's sexual victimhood and its echoes with the women's movement and nationalist imagination underlies activists' effective investment in the prostituted woman, giving new life to the old symbol of the nation's woes. However, to the extent that it gains political and cultural legitimacy through the echoes of victimhood, it also silences any claims for sex worker rights with the full weight of the imagined nation. Sex workers and their allies often get accused of being sympathizers for Japanese colonialism or being infected with Western ideas irrelevant to the Korean context. Victimhood becomes the exclusively legitimate basis for women to make claims for state protection. Yet this preoccupation with injury has consequences on real people's lives. Effectively, it silences a broader understanding of rights and critique of injustices faced by women in prostitution, including the fierce urban renewal and a skewed labor market. Activists' collaboration with the state, as well as the consistent demand for stronger law enforcement, has made broader critiques of the state difficult. For example, employability and self-sufficiency came to define the emergent welfare policies in South Korea. in the self-sufficiency training programs for prostituted women. They were encouraged to receive training and be part of the docile labor force as cleaners, cooks, and drivers. Yet women bore the brunt of unemployment and underemployment under the demand for flexible labor, especially those in the 20 to 29 age range. Korean women make slightly less than 60% of male average earnings, and having the highest wage gap of 40% in OECD countries. Korea Labor Institute showed that between November 2008 and May 2009, the last crisis that Korea went through, 98% of the job cuts were female, and a total of 877,000 females in their 30s lost their jobs during this period. Activists have insisted on the urgency of eliminating prostitution, but few have brought in any critique of these gender injustices. Mainstream women activists have come a long way from being dissident activists in the 1980s to allying with the state for their goals. A focus on legislative reforms, institutionalization, stronger law enforcement, and a more punitive penal state has come to define the way forward for the women's movement in South Korea. Heavy penalization of the criminal is the logical response to the protection of innocent victims as they both individualize injustices and sufferings, rendering invisible the structures and inequalities that generate suffering in the first place. The preoccupation with male demand for sex as the cause of violence suffered by prostituted women further exonerates the state and capital from any responsibilities for gendered injustices in the broader context. The hegemony of victimhood makes innocence and injury the only legitimate premise for making claims on the state. Any departure from victimhood in making claims is not only a violation of normative processes, but also a disruption of the political and cultural logic of the women's movement and the affected community of the Korean nation. As women in prostitution become reconfigured as victims of sex trafficking, their political space became circumscribed as objects of state protection and targets of rehabilitation to their proper gender and class locations. Women activists have cast a heavy historical burden on women in prostitution to challenge patriarchy, militarism, colonialism, and globalization. If all prostituted women would just be rehabilitated and restored, then these evils will also be undone. The imagination in this narrative reproduces a cultural and gender essentialism that women activists have fought so hard to dismantle in the past decades. One must bear in mind that such passions for a romanticized nation, unified and homogeneous, consistently articulated as a we that disavows difference, reifies victimhood, and champions innocence, are consistent with a masculinist imagination of the nation. Only this time round, they are pursued on the backs of women in prostitution. The passionate activism of women activists may say less about the state of prostitution in South Korea than the activists' subjectivity as historical and global subjects. Women activists like Cho and Jo have high hopes that the global anti-trafficking efforts have provided them with an anchor to renew their struggles and propel their movement both nationally and globally. The victimhood of South Korean prostituted women allows women activists to participate and circulate effectively in the effective economy of the global campaign. The more victimized they are, the more legitimacy activists gain in being a global spokesperson on the subject of trafficking, and the more a global hegemony of victimhood presides over our understanding of female sexual labor and migration. Yet, if the silences on human rights, capital, and the state that we observe in South Korea is any indication to foster a global movement that individualizes both suffering and evil, that encourage fears about female sexuality, and reifies the family as the proper feminine realm, and that promotes a strong criminal justice system as solution to all problems of injustices, would translate into an active silencing of dissent, erasure of the structural underpinnings of inequalities, and the circumscription of human rights for the service of the status quo. Thank you.
Benjamin. Muchas gracias, Silly. Thank you very much, Silly. Ahora vamos a contar con 15 minutos aproximadamente de comentarios a cargo de Adriana Piscitelli y de Lohana Berkins. La idea de esta plenaria, como las de mañana a la mañana con Jennifer Hirsch y la de mañana a la tarde con Gary Dowsett, la del viernes con Jane Bennett y la del sábado con Mara Viveros, es que haya un diálogo interregional, aparte, por supuesto, desde diversas perspectivas, pero poder dialogar, por ejemplo, ahora desde América Latina, sobre otras regiones que no son menos familiares o nada familiares. Así que ya estamos sentadas y sentados. No sé quién quiere empezar, si Lohana o Adriana. Si no, sorteo yo.
Ok, yo voy.
Adriana, Piscitelli.
Bueno, buenas noches a todos. Yo voy a comenzar agradeciendo al comité organizador de este encuentro y particularmente a Mario Pecheny la invitación para participar de esta sesión, dándome la oportunidad de comentar el texto de Cheng, que me pareció brillante, y también de compartir con ustedes algunas inquietudes en relación a las problemáticas que ella trabaja. Pero antes que nada, quiero dejar claro cuál es el lugar desde el que hago estos comentarios. Soy antropóloga, soy feminista y he trabajado desde inicios de la década de 2000 con la inserción de brasileñas en los mercados transnacionales del sexo. Comencé realizando investigaciones en circuitos del así llamado turismo sexual en el nordeste del Brasil, en los que circulan extranjeros de diversas nacionalidades, pero sobre todo europeos. Y continué sus estudios analizando la inserción de brasileñas en los mercados del sexo en países del sur de Europa, en Italia y en España, y la implicación entre esos mercados y los mercados matrimoniales. Trabajé sobre todo con mujeres, pero las investigaciones en España incluyeron también algunas travestis. Y como sucedió con otras personas que investigaron temas vinculados al trabajo sexual, mi intención inicial no fue abordar la problemática de la trata de personas, pero tuve que enfrentarla porque prácticamente se me imponía, porque los debates y acciones dedicadas a combatirla afectaban seriamente la movilidad de los proyectos migratorios de las personas con las que trabajé. Durante un tiempo, yo diría que considerable, traté de participar en el debate contraponiendo las voces y los deseos de esas personas a las nociones presentes en los debates y en las acciones contra la trata, y mostrando cómo las violaciones de los derechos de esas personas eran muchas veces perpetrados por diferentes estados nacionales. En ese punto, yo diría que mi trayectoria se asemeja a la de varios otros investigadores en diferentes partes del mundo y también en Brasil. Algunos de los que, como Tadeo Blanchet, Ana Paula da Silva, José Miguel Nieto Olivar, están aquí en la platera. Y con el tiempo me fui dando cuenta de que este esfuerzo era complicado en términos teóricos y no tenía los efectos políticos que esperaba. Era complicado porque ese camino analítico reconocía la capacidad de acción de esas personas, por ejemplo, en relación a sus proyectos migratorios, pero también las victimizaba, sustituyendo el crimen organizado por otras entidades opresoras como los estados nacionales. Y en términos políticos, esa contraposición de voces no tenía los efectos que yo esperaba, contribuyendo con que se respetasen los intereses de las personas con las que trabajé. Yo diría que al contrario, los agentes involucrados en esos debates y acciones fueron canibalizando nuestros argumentos, dándoles otros sentidos. Explicábamos los motivos por los que las trabajadoras sexuales que circulaban para ofrecer servicios sexuales no se consideraban víctimas, aunque hubieran contraído deudas en ese proceso, ni pensaban que eran explotadas sexualmente. Pero nuestras observaciones eran leídas como expresión de la ignorancia o falta de percepción de las trabajadoras sexuales de que eran víctimas de un crimen. Un problema que debía ser resuelto intensificando los esfuerzos de educación sobre la trata y ampliando los movimientos antitrata. Bueno, a lo largo de ese trayecto fui percibiendo la necesidad de centrar los esfuerzos de investigación en otros aspectos de las dinámicas de estos debates y acciones. Y en el marco de estas experiencias realmente aprecié la presentación de Cheng, que realiza ese esfuerzo centrándose en la subjetividad y en las emociones de activistas antitrata en Corea del Sur. Y a partir de ese esfuerzo contribuye con puntos importantes para pensar en los debates y acciones sobre trabajo sexual y trata de personas. Yo voy a llamar la atención sobre 3 de esos puntos, a partir de los que me parece que podemos dialogar, ampliando y profundizando el debate crítico sobre trabajo sexual y trata de personas. El primer punto es que Cheng realiza un bello trabajo mostrando cómo los debates y acciones transnacionales vinculados a estas problemáticas se articulan con nociones y con proyectos nacionales, y mostrando también efectos de esas articulaciones. Y con esto ilumina una cuestión que para mí es intrigante, que es cómo en diversos países, y pienso en los países que conozco mejor, en América del Norte y del Sur, en el Caribe y en el norte y en el sur de Europa, cómo en esos diversos países los debates y acciones sobre esas problemáticas, trabajo sexual y trata, muestran algunas convergencias significativas, porque en lugares con diferentes modelos legales relativos a la prostitución y con situaciones diversificadas en lo que se refiere a los flujos migratorios, el debate sobre la trata, utilizando un lenguaje de protección a los derechos humanos, tiende a contribuir en el combate a la prostitución, inclusive en países en los que no es ilegal, además de en muchos casos ofrecer realmente escasa protección a las víctimas de ese crimen, a las personas que son designadas como víctimas de ese crimen. Yo creo que en ese sentido Cheng hace un trabajo excelente mostrando cómo aspectos de un debate altamente complejo y ambiguo en el plano transnacional son apropiados nacionalmente para activistas que siguen una lógica en la que el combate a la prostitución evoca el rechazo a las invasiones extranjeras. Y en el marco de esta lucha son alteradas las leyes sobre prostitución, que pasa a ser sinónimo de trata, todas las prostitutas pasan a ser victimizadas y las que insisten en continuar siendo trabajadoras sexuales son percibidas como enemigas. Bueno, conociendo la importancia de las disposiciones legales en las acciones antitrata y también la realidad de países como Brasil y España, por ejemplo, en los que la prostitución no es criminalizada, pero en los que las alteraciones que fueron hechas hasta el momento en las leyes para armonizarlas con disposiciones legales supranacionales, el protocolo de Parana, por ejemplo, introdujeron elementos que aumentan la criminalización en torno a la prostitución y borran diferencias entre esa actividad, la explotación sexual y muchas veces la trata. Yo preguntaría en qué consistieron las nuevas leyes antiprostitución de 2004 en Corea del Sur, cómo modificaron las leyes anteriormente existentes. y cómo esas reformas se relacionaron con las disposiciones legales supranacionales. Y también preguntaría sobre las relaciones entre esas alteraciones y la participación de las líderes activistas del movimiento de mujeres de Corea del Sur en el movimiento global antitrata. Y si las integrantes de ese movimiento son feministas, a partir de cuáles perspectivas feministas realizaron alianzas transnacionales en el combate a la trata. El segundo punto sobre el que quería llamar la atención es el énfasis que Sealing otorga a los aspectos emocionales que alimentan las acciones de esas líderes. Y que alimentan esas acciones adquiriendo fuerza en un movimiento en el que la culpa es atribuida no a hombres individuales, sino a los agresores extranjeros. Considerando las particularidades, claro, contextuales, yo quería observar que el tema de los agresores extranjeros está presente en las discusiones sobre turismo sexual en Brasil, como Tadeu se ha analizado muy bien, y en las fusiones que se realizan entre turismo sexual y trata de personas. En este país, en Brasil, parte de las expresiones de modernización en lo que se refiere a la sexualidad, y más recientemente de cierto desplazamiento en la posición geopolítica de una nación que ha crecido económicamente, reducido desigualdades y está atrayendo migración de diferentes países, inclusive del norte global, se materializa en acciones dirigidas a la represión de la trata. Un aspecto intrigante para mí ha sido que, a pesar de las especificidades nacionales, el movimiento antitrata en Brasil diseminó su causa mediante una pedagogía que adquiere fuerza emocional de maneras parecidas a la que es accionada en varios otros países. Es una especie de pedagogía del miedo, y aquí utilizo la expresión de una investigadora brasileña, Laura Lovenkron, con la que se sensibiliza a la población sobre el drama de la trata y se la alerta para el peligro que la trata ofrece, utilizando imágenes que son interesantes porque si algunas fueron producidas en el país mostrando víctimas con pieles más oscuras, con cierto aire a pobreza, muchas otras representando mujeres blancas, rubias, son importadas del exterior. Pero es un conjunto de imágenes que son muy parecidas en el sentido de que reiteran los mismos temas. Muestran predominantemente mujeres, rara vez travestis, son altamente feminizadas, sensualizadas y evocan al mismo tiempo las ideas de prisión, esclavitud, mercantilización del cuerpo, impotencia, incapacidad de reaccionar, miedo y dolor. Mi pregunta aquí es, considerando las especificidades del contexto en que Sealing trabajó, si hay ecos de esta producción prácticamente transnacional de imágenes de víctimas de la trata en Corea del Sur. Finalmente, casi acabando, el último punto sobre el que quería llamar la atención es sobre la utilidad de la noción de víctima en la promoción del acceso a derechos. Las discusiones académicas, y como Sealing señala muy bien en su texto, ofrecen argumentos que muestran cómo las posibilidades para la obtención de justicia social a partir de esta noción son problemáticas. Como investigadora yo tengo una cantidad de manifestaciones de la manera perversa en que esa categoría es utilizada en el ámbito de las acciones antitrata en España y en Brasil. Es accionada para movilizar la sensibilidad pública, pero después es borrada, englobada por la categoría de migrante irregular, por ejemplo, mediante la cual las trabajadoras sexuales extranjeras son deportadas, y otras veces la categoría víctima es englobada en la categoría de denunciante. Cuando las trabajadoras sexuales son protegidas y acceden a permisos de residencia, por lo menos temporáneos, apenas exclusivamente en función de su rol como testigos en juicios contra tratantes. Pero, al mismo tiempo, para muchos activistas en América Latina, la categoría víctima, así como el lenguaje de los derechos humanos, es considerada una de las herramientas posibles y viables para el reconocimiento de los daños sufridos y para el acceso a los derechos. Quiero decir que a veces esta categoría es considerada como el camino que puede tornar a alguien sujeto de derecho. Mi pregunta para Silvia, y es la última, es considerando los problemas que presenta la categoría víctima, ¿qué alternativas ella imagina que serían posibles a partir del contexto que estudió para garantizar los derechos de las trabajadoras sexuales?
Agradezco a Mario Pecheny el haberme invitado y también, como hizo la compañera, agradezco estar invitada acá y compartir con ella. Me parece hacer una pequeña cartografía de dónde yo voy a hablar. Primero, muchos años de mi vida he sido puta, soy feminista y soy abolicionista. Entonces mis palabras, mis reflexiones van a estar desde ese lugar y lo que me provocó el estudio de la compañera, todo lo que me interpeló, ¿no? En primer lugar, cuando se habla de la prostitución, siempre se habla de una sujeta mujer como única víctima. Las personas travestis, transexuales, transgénero o como se llamen en distintos lugares del mundo, no somos reconocidas como víctimas, no somos reconocidas como sujeta tensionante en el tema de la prostitución. Segundo, a mí me parece que me sorprende, ¿no?, este énfasis en debatir la trata, cosa que acá, llamemos como nos llamemos, prostitutas, putas, trabajadoras sexuales, jineteras, acompañantes, como sea, todas vamos a coincidir en condenar a la trata. Ahora lo que produce ese debate es el desplazamiento de la medularidad de qué es la prostitución, ¿no? Y en el trabajo de la compañera a mí me llamó mucho la atención que no se discutiera el dinero, por ejemplo, ¿no? O sea que como el dinero no estaba, digo, llamemos como nos llamemos, digamos, ¿cuál es el fin último? El dinero. Es como cuando nos oponemos a la trata pero estamos de acuerdo en la postura que sea un trabajo. ¿Para qué se trata a una persona? Para prostituirla. Entonces me parece que lo que antecede a este debate es la prostitución. Lo que tenemos que poner en debate y seguir poniendo en tensión es la prostitución. Y ahí me surge una pregunta. ¿Quién construye a la víctima? ¿La academia la construye? ¿Cuál es el espacio real que nosotras tenemos para decir nuestras posturas? Porque después empieza como a enrarecer el debate. A las abolicionistas nos tratan como poseedoras de una moral victoriana, que cansadas de ser maltratadas, violadas, negadas de derechos, pobres, abusadas, violentadas en toda la forma, este aquí que nos convertimos mágicamente en inquisidoras de nuestras propias compañeras. Nosotras no somos eso. Nosotras no queremos la prostitución porque también somos víctimas y no queremos ser la mercancía. No queremos ser la mercancía. Me parece terrible que nosotras pensemos que lo único que podemos vender es nuestro cuerpo, que los estados no nos vean como fuerzas productoras de trabajo. Entonces nosotros también queremos discutir estas cuestiones, porque si no después uy, ustedes con su discurso de víctimas, de cómo sufren. Y acá yo separo dos debates. Uno es el debate de las mujeres en sí mismo, que tiene que ver con las realidades de las mujeres, y otra es el debate de las travestis. Se nos niegan todos los derechos. No todas las mujeres pobres se prostituyen. Ahora, si en una comunidad hay 100 travestis, las 100 nos prostituimos. Eso es un síntoma a analizar muy fuerte, muy claro. Ahí hay algo que se está diciendo, ¿no? ¿Cómo podemos crear fenotipos de personas para que solo se dediquen a la prostitución? ¿Cuáles serían las características? ¿Dónde se constituye la identidad de puta o de trabajadora sexual? ¿Dónde se constituye? ¿Cuál sería? Y otra cuestión también me parece traer a la mesa, si vamos a discutir la prostitución o cómo se la va a llamar, discutámoslo todo. Como algunas compañeras plantean, no es la autonomía de las mujeres que pueden ser prostitutas. ¿De qué autonomía estamos hablando? De volverle a entregar a los estados corruptos, a estados perversos que históricamente hicieron un control de nuestros cuerpos, ahora se lo damos nuevamente para que nos controlen. El matrimonio también es una forma de control del cuerpo de las mujeres. ¿Y cuál es la diferencia de la señora y de la puta? Son grandes interrogantes, todo lo estoy tirando como grandes interrogantes, grandes preguntas que nosotros nos hacemos. ¿Cómo funcionaría la prostitución en términos concretos? ¿Quién la va a dirigir? ¿Quién va a delimitar la delgada línea entre yo soy la que regentea el prostíbulo y yo soy la proxeneta del prostíbulo? Porque también hay que develar lo que es el mundo prostitucional, porque si no seguimos discutiendo sobre la ficcionalidad de la prostitución. Yo estaba parada, vino un cliente, me dio $500, yo siempre digo lo mismo, Mujer Bonita es una película y es eso nada más. No sé si todos saben que Mujer Bonita es la película de Julia Roberts. Entonces digo, yo quiero ver todo eso, porque el creer que la prostitución solo depende de nosotras es un error. Hay una estructuralidad de la prostitución, hay una arquitectura donde está situada la prostitución, ¿no? Todos los que viven de nosotras, los que lucran, la explotación, todas esas cuestiones yo quería traer también, me parece, para debatir. Porque si vamos a debatir el tema, bueno, debatámoslo con todo. Que después cada quien saque sus propias conclusiones de qué lado se pone, ¿no? Pero me parece interesante generar. Y otra cosa que veo como negativo, lo señalo, es mientras sigamos alimentando este debate, si somos mujeres en situación y travestis en situación de prostitución, somos trabajadoras sexuales, las únicas damnificadas seguimos siendo nosotras. Porque los estados no van a generar otro tipo de política mientras sigamos en ese debate entrampada. Entonces yo creo que ahí también tenemos la responsabilidad de decir, bueno, ¿cómo construimos? ¿Quién construye a la víctima? ¿Y qué tenemos para decir ambos sectores? Porque esta cuestión de la moral, pensar que la respuesta a una férrea moral, ¿no?, es la prostitución, la verdad, a mí me parece un argumento muy, no sé, no quiero ser así descalificativa, muy endeble, muy chiquito, digamos, ¿no? También pido perdón por el lenguaje, uso mi lenguaje y resisto al colonialismo de los idiomas, entonces trato de usar mi propio lenguaje. Entonces eso también me parece que tomar eso solo y después otras preguntas que también surgen es, en la prostitución, ¿qué se vende en realidad? ¿Quién compra y quién vende? ¿Qué se pone en juego ahí? ¿Qué es? A ver, y que es cuando nosotras decimos, como víctimas de la prostitución, que es una relación de desigualdad, es una relación de desigualdad. Porque fíjense, para mí es el hecho más puro, voy a usar una palabra puro, si se quiere, porque el hombre tiene claro lo que yo quiero de él, que es su dinero, ¿no? Y yo tengo claro lo que el hombre quiere de mí, y siempre en términos de hombre, porque los mayores consumidores son los varones, ¿no? No voy a decir los únicos, pero son los mayores consumidores. Entonces ahí hay un hecho clarísimo. Ahora, lo que no existe es condición de negociación. No existe una condición de negociación, ¿no? Porque no existe. No querés, el hombre sabe lo que va a buscar, el hombre sabe lo que quiere. Entonces, vos no me lo das, bueno, no importa, yo me voy con mi dinero a otro lado. Es muy claro. Lo que nosotros nos volvemos es hábil en esa situación. Pero digo, no hay ninguna posibilidad de negociación. Y el hombre paga expresamente por lo que quiere. Yo nunca vi el amor en el término de la prostitución, si nos ponemos a discutir en términos de amor, no sé. Porque en todo caso es el deseo de él, porque no es que él paga para satisfacer mi deseo. No, él está comprándome para que yo satisfaga su deseo. Entonces, ¿de qué amor podríamos hablar? ¿No? La relación es clara. El hombre viene y dice, yo quiero que vos me hagas esto, y yo te pago para esto, y lo tenés que hacer como yo quiera que vos lo hagas. Después, otra cuestión también confusa es cuando se plantea en términos de derecho. Para exigir, digo, cuando ya se habla de derecho, a las claras está, es una obviedad que hay una violación de derecho o una negación de un derecho. No es que alegremente uno va y pide algo, ¿no? Entonces, cuando nosotros planteamos en términos de derecho, muchos discursos están abonados en que el reconocimiento de la categoría como trabajadoras sexuales les va a garantizar un montón de derechos. No conozco las legislaciones de todo el mundo, sí conozco nuestra legislación, y acá podemos decir claramente que es una falacia, porque todo lo que se propone en este Estado se lo puede conseguir, ¿no? Es el derecho a la educación, el derecho a la vivienda, el derecho a... Bueno, nosotros planteamos un derecho al trabajo, que no es la categoría de trabajo sexual, se lo puede conseguir. Pero después nos dimos cuenta que por qué íbamos a pedir esos derechos si ya estaban consagrados en nuestra legislación. Y empezamos a cambiar el discurso y empezamos a plantear el acceso a esos derechos. Y ahora no solo el acceso a esos derechos, la permanencia dentro de esos derechos. Porque si no también es como tramposo, ¿no? Que nos dicen, bueno, podés estudiar, pero a mí no me importa de qué podés estudiar. Así que a mí la verdad me interesa mucho de seguir este debate, pero de seguirlo con todos los elementos, ¿no? Porque la prostitución no es un hecho fortuito. Y otra cuestión también que aparece es, bueno, al final todos ponemos el cuerpo para trabajar. Es verdad que todos ponemos el cuerpo para trabajar. Ahora, las implicancias, las consecuencias y lo que produce la prostitución no es lo mismo que todo otro trabajo. Tiene implicancias concretas, ¿no? La pérdida de la autoestima, nosotros nos sentimos victimarias en vez de víctima. Y después, por último, otra pregunta también, otro signo de interrogación que planteamos es: si fuera un trabajo, ¿cómo y dónde se lo va a enseñar? Ese es también un gran interrogante que tenemos. Muchas gracias.
Bueno, como se darán cuenta, nada de todo esto se podrá hacer se habla cuando se habla de trabajo sexual, y el sábado a la tardecita, en una actividad del Centro Latinoamericano de Sexualidad y Derechos Humanos, CLAM, también Adriana y otras compañeras van a seguir discutiendo específicamente el tema del trabajo sexual y la prostitución. Ahora tenemos, digamos, 18 minutos. Todas aquellas personas que sean capaces de expresarse en hasta un minuto, levanten la mano y haremos 3 o 4 presentaciones y después una ronda final de Ceiling, de Lohana y de Adriana. Lo digo en inglés, not more than 1 minute per person. Vamos a empezar de atrás para adelante. Dicen que... No, dicen, you need the microphones, o tú necesitas un micrófono, y ahí te lo estarán llevando. Eso espero. No espero. Entonces, quienes quieran, vengan por favor acá please come here and talk with this microphone. Please come here because of the translation. We need you to talk to the microphone.
Vengo de la República Dominicana. Yo soy activista. Soy también coordinadora de una ONG que trabaja con trabajadoras sexuales trans, travesti en República Dominicana. Alguna vez nosotras, es una problemática que hay, no solo en tu país. Nuestro país también es el país que sufre más por la inclusión social que hay, por la falta de oportunidades. Todas las personas trans y travesti es la única puerta de entrada que tienen para sostenerse. El trabajo sexual. Donde ese trabajo sexual, las compañeras son víctimas de asesinatos, víctimas de violencia policial, víctimas de todo, pasan todo. No solo que el trabajo sexual, nosotras no miramos que vender el cuerpo es una satisfacción, sino es una necesidad que la sociedad ha hecho en nuestro país. No etiquetados como personas que la puerta que tenemos abierto es ejercer el trabajo sexual, pero nosotras como población y tenemos nuestra institución, trabajamos con nuestra compañera para que ellas sepan sus derechos, cómo poder defenderse, que no solo el trabajo sexual tampoco, porque estamos trabajando para enseñarle también que hay otra oportunidad. Si trabajamos juntas, hacemos una red, todo será mejor para todos.
Por favor, un minutito, 1 minute.
Hola. Mi nombre es Georgina Orellano, yo soy militante de AMAD, la Asociación de Mujeres Beneficiarias de la Argentina. Soy felizmente y orgullosamente trabajadora sexual autónoma, por decisión propia. Soy una mujer, como ustedes verán, mayor de edad, en la cual ejerzo, no vendo mi cuerpo, porque estoy completa, tengo mis tecas acá. Como verán, sí ofrezco servicios sexuales a cambio de una remuneración económica, en las cuales la mayoría de las veces los clientes no me piden servicios sexuales, sino acompañamiento. Tengo clientes que se enamoran de mí, que vienen a comprar fantasías. Obviamente que yo soy trabajadora, puedo disfrutar mi sexualidad libremente y separar lo que es el amor de la sexualidad en el trabajo. Y después también escuchando la verdad de las compañeras.
Un minutito, por favor, así después pueden volver.
Sí, bueno,
directo al punto.
Argentina es un país en los cuales en los últimos 2 años se han aprobado muchísimas políticas antitrata que han criminalizado a nuestro sector, que tenemos muchísimas compañeras que sufren la persecución policial, que a través de esta ley donde nos tratan de revictimizar, nos niegan la autonomía, la autodeterminación como trabajadoras. Tenemos muchísimas compañeras que han perdido su fuente laboral, que han perdido su autonomía, que de ser trabajadoras sexuales autónomas y lograr desprenderse
la figura del proxeneta han vuelto a trabajar bajo el proxenetismo y me parece que Argentina, como es un país progresista donde hay leyes, la ley de matrimonio igualitario, ley de identidad de género, no se puede negar a otorgarnos derechos a nosotras, las que nos consideramos trabajadoras sexuales autónomas, y tener derechos como nosotras nos consideramos. Entonces por eso hemos presentado el mes pasado una ley para que regularice el trabajo sexual autónomo y nos dé derechos como tiene cualquier trabajador, y ese marco legal que nos pueda sacar de la clandestinidad en la cual hoy por hoy nosotras estamos sumergidas. No.
No, la verdad que como vamos a tener una mesa, bueno, buenas tardes a todas y a todos. Soy Elena Reinal, secretaria ejecutiva de la Red Latinoamericana y del Caribe de Trabajadoras Sexuales, orgullosamente trabajadora sexual, orgullosamente. Me quería contar que yo trabajé muchos años con Lohana, Berkins parada en la esquina, y entonces decirle a mi compañera, que a la cual respeto muchísimo por su lucha, pero bueno, no coincido con ella, decirle que cuando ella habla de las marcas que nos deja en el cuerpo, como verán yo no tengo ninguna, lo único que tengo son gorduras. No estoy loca, ¿me entienden? No estoy adicta a ninguna droga ni nada por el estilo, estoy coherente, por eso pude fundar junto con Lohana Berkins justamente la organización a la cual hoy lleva 20 años. Y soy tan atrevida y transgresora que también pude hacer la revolución en Latinoamérica y el Caribe, y hoy tenemos más de 65 organizaciones de trabajadoras sexuales. Lo único que quiero decir es, déjenos soñar, déjenos equivocarnos, ¿me entienden? Déjenos que nosotras seamos lo que queremos ser. Me parece que eso es el mejor, digamos, respeto a los derechos humanos. Nosotros no vamos por las trans, no queremos que las trans hablen en nombre de nosotras. Tenemos voz propia. Eso es lo que te quiero decir, compañera.
Voy a pedirle a 3 personas que van a hablar que se refieran a la presentación de Ceiling y el tema de la mesa por una cuestión puramente de usos y costumbres de las mesas redondas. Si es para hablar así que 1 minuto no más, sino directamente cortamos y volvemos a la mesa. Digo, porque son las 8
Okay, I will try to wrap up in 1 minute. I have several things to say. First of all, I'm a transgender person, I'm a sex worker, and I think sex work is work. It's a decent work. Secondly, we are not victims. We should not be perceived as victims. And we are not merchandising our bodies. We are merchandising our sexual services. Our bodies are with us, as you can see. Thirdly, it's an autonomy issue. It's an agency issue. And sometimes, and in many times, sex work is something for many women to strengthen themselves against men. It's not something to victimize women. And some people say that prostitution is an architecture by the state or by men. I believe that it's maybe an architecture to strengthen women, but what about other jobs? And finally, exploitation or violence is not coming, it's not inherent to sex work. It is because there are lack of legislations that protect sex work. So we need decriminalization, and we need to understand that sex work is a decent work. It's a real work. Thanks.
Desde Colombia, trabajo con la Corporación de Acción Técnica Social en los proyectos de consumo responsable de sustancias psicoactivas, y hoy mi pregunta para Silly es si dentro de su investigación está refiriéndose únicamente a mujeres de sexo femenino o también están incluidas las personas trans del sur de Corea. Y bueno, pues también haciendo, para mí no sería una claridad sino una apreciación sobre la intervención de Lohana, y es que no entiendo por qué hay necesidad de marcar diferencia entre las mujeres de sexo femenino y las mujeres de sexo masculino, si finalmente todas construimos una identidad desde lo que es la feminidad. Obviamente tenemos necesidades biológicas y médicas diferentes, pero a la hora de la verdad, como tú misma lo decías, todos y todas tenemos los mismos derechos amparados por bajo la Constitución de cada uno de nuestros países.
I guess I'll speak in English. My name is Thaddeus Planchet. I'm a professor of anthropology at Federal University of Rio de Janeiro and an allied researcher with the Vida Prostitutes Rights Organization in Rio de Janeiro. Like Laura Augustine, I listen to everything that sex workers tell me. When a sex worker tells me that they've been forced, they've been pushed into prostitution, they've been trafficked, I tend to try to believe them. And when they tell me that they're doing it by their own free will, I tend to try to believe them. I try not to judge on that. But what in the name of sweet fucking screaming Jesus Christ makes any rational person who is committed to a revolutionary model of gender relations and to liberation believe that the neoliberal state, with its current carceral model, through the criminalization of sex work and prostitution, is somehow going to make a positive impact on these men and women and trans people's lives? That is what I just do not understand. I cannot understand how someone who claims to be working in favor of human rights for sex workers, prostitutes, or whatever word you want to call them, can think that the police, who are 3 times more likely to rape a sex worker or kill a sex worker than a client, should be out there arresting people. That is what I do not understand.
My name is Akshay. I'm an anthropologist and a queer activist from India. My question is for Celine, actually. I'm trying to understand the affective turn in the study of sexuality. And from what how I understand it, the affective turn is driven by several frustrations, one of which is the limits of the mind-body dualism and the subjugation of the body to the mind, conceptually. I'm wondering whether the focus on affect effectively desubjugates the body, or what is the place of the body in a theory of affect? That would be my conceptual question.
Okay. Muito obrigado por hablar en otra cosa. Voy a pedir a Adriana y a Lohana que sean muy breves y así un poco menos breves, pero también breves, y después pasamos al festejo. Como verán, empezamos con los ánimos entusiasmados.
A ver, por más que se levante todo el auditorio, no voy a discutir acá mi categoría de víctima. A mí me parece que si las compañeras trabajadoras sexuales quieren producir un debate, lo podemos hacer fuera de la cuestión mediática de generar un efecto, porque la verdad a mí en lo personal no me interesa. Y sí voy a seguir siendo fiel a Elena Reinaga, porque quiero aclararle a los que no son de acá que he sido la fundadora de AMAR y nunca nos hemos definido como trabajadoras sexuales, y cada palabra de la que diga la digo en nombre de miles y millones de víctimas de la prostitución, de miles de compañeras que terminan en las peores condiciones de vida. Entonces, si tenemos que generar un debate, lo generemos, pero me parece que la espectacularidad no produce nada. Cuando yo acepté venir acá, sabía que primero iba a estar entre 2 personas que no eran abolicionistas y que la mayoría del auditorio es pro trabajo sexual. Pero me parece que podemos debatir y que la violencia, fijémonos quién la ejerce. Insisto, mis palabras son en memoria de las miles y miles de personas que fuimos víctimas y que somos víctimas de la prostitución. Gracias.
Bueno, le agradezco a Mario la oportunidad de poder hablar de nuevo, pero en realidad yo voy a pasar la palabra a Brasil para que pueda aprovechar y discutir más aspectos de su trabajo que es tan interesante.
Me dijeron ahí que nos quedan 10 minutos, así que por favor aguanten 10 minutes and then think. Toma.
Well, thank you very much for the most exciting exchange of questions and opinions here, partly related to my presentation. I think that one of the most important things that came up in this range of comments was most important theme that came out of the exchange was, okay, what does a victimhood do as a category? Is there an alternative to victimhood if we are not happy about it? Okay, so one of the criticisms that has been launched was that, okay, if you're making yourself a victim, then you're asking for state protection. Is that the only relationship you can have with the state, is my question. Because an alternative, a possible alternative, is that you are a citizen. As someone who raised a question here said, that we have the same rights. There's the Constitution, and we all have the same rights, no matter whether you're transgender, you're a man, you're a woman. At the same time, there are limits to that framework, because yes, the Constitution is there in black and white, but what do you do about it? Is the state automatically fulfilling those rights? No, as we all know, the state needs to be whipped into fulfilling its obligation, right, to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights. So human rights is always going to be a platform for a struggle for rights. And to readily contain your identity as a victim rather than a rights-bearing citizen, I think is preempting a lot of possibilities for engagement and for empowerment. So that's partly to answer your question. I think the alternative is to think about rights and citizenship. And while I see that I did not have a chance to present my ethnographic data here, but my book, which was on so-called military prostitution in South Korea, is called On the Move for Love, because I feel that it was such an important theme. Whether it's a self-love, romantic love, familial love, it all came through in the negotiations between the Filipino entertainers and the American soldiers in their site of dislocation in South Korea. So, for me, the possible emotional exchange, the emotional manipulation, is part of what is being transacted in this relationship. It's not necessarily your body, and as someone said, even if your body is involved, you're not selling your body. It's just part of your activities. And I think the women that I worked with, the Filipino entertainers, they are very clear that they are there not just as a body, but as an emotional being. And that's why the talk of love is consistent. That they talk about, they said, I have boyfriends, I have just boyfriends, and I have real boyfriends. So there are 3 different names for boyfriends. And they try to control their emotional lives, they try to manipulate other people's emotional lives, but they don't necessarily always succeed. Money is involved, and that's something that I mentioned at the beginning. Money was in fact one way of assessing how much do you love me. Are you giving me $300 every week for buying my time out of the bar? Not necessarily to have sex. Does it mean that you really do not love me that much when you are paying another woman $300 to have sex? I have actually, some of the women said, I felt so hurt because he paid $300 to another woman. I thought he loved me. So, it is part of the equation in my research. Love, money, sex. So, there's one point I want to make. And the final point, before I think someone else may jump in, is I think we are trying to broaden the discussion to larger structures of inequalities. Eliminating prostitution, even if you succeed, does not translate into eliminating those structures of inequalities. I seriously doubt that if we eliminated prostitution, lives for transgender people will be better. So I think our job is to locate the vulnerabilities of sex workers, transgender, male, female, within the larger neoliberal transformations that we are trying to engage in. That right now, the state is trying to be nice, to save women, to save these sex workers, to save victims of trafficking. But what are they saving them into? They are saving them into the docile, working class women and men and that should stay in their position as cleaners, as cooks, as drivers, just, don't try to aspire to buy name brands. This is one of the comments from the applicants, that if they did not have sex work to make money, then they will not be buying all these expensive foreign brands. And foreign brand is sometimes a stigma in South Korea because then you're betraying the nation. So we need to broaden our discussion to larger structures of inequalities that deny you or any other person access to their rights as a citizen.
Espero que haya salido de aquí el posible, probable papel que podamos tener desde las ciencias sociales para aportar a estas discusiones, a estos debates. Les aviso, mañana 8:30 de la mañana en el Hotel Bowen, donde sigue este congreso, hay un desayuno que va a preceder a otra plenaria a cargo de Cheng sobre deseos a través de la frontera, con dos grandes discutidoras y discutidores. Todo el mundo 8:30.